From the very beginning of human history, the question of whether we are truly free or merely acting out predetermined scripts has haunted philosophers, scientists, and seekers of truth alike. And yet, in recent decades, an experiment has emerged that challenges every assumption we've ever made about choice, decision making, and what it means to be human. An experiment so subtle and so profound that once you understand it, you may never again experience the concept of free will in the same way. For the results point to a shocking realization. The decisions you believe you consciously make may already be decided for you before you even become aware of them. And this realization is both terrifying and liberating because it collapses the old narratives of control and opens a door to a deeper understanding of consciousness itself. And as we peel back the layers of this discovery, we begin to see not only that the mind is more mysterious than we ever thought, but also that the very fabric of reality is intertwined with our awareness in ways we can scarcely imagine. And to truly grasp the significance of this, we need to step back into the origins of the free will debate, to the philosophers of ancient Greece like Aristotle, who wrestled with the problem of determinism, to the spiritual traditions of the East that spoke of karma and destiny, to the Enlightenment thinkers who believed rational choice was the essence of human dignity. And then fast forward to the 20th century, where neuroscience began to dismantle the myth by probing the hidden timings of brain activity. And it is here, in the laboratory of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, that the infamous experiment took place which revealed that brain activity predicting a decision to act occurred a fraction of a second before a participant reported making the conscious choice, suggesting that what we call decision may actually be an afterthought, a story we tell ourselves to explain what our unconscious brain had already set in motion. And the implications of this finding ripple across every domain of our lives. For if our choices are prepared beneath the surface of awareness, then where does responsibility lie? Where does morality fit in? How do we punish or reward? And can we even say that we're the authors of our own lives? And to appreciate the full gravity of this, we must go slowly, layer by layer, through the evidence, the interpretations, the criticisms, and the shocking metaphysical doorways that open one's free will is stripped of an illusion. And as you read these words, perhaps you can already feel the strange paradox forming in your own mind. You chose to read this, didn't you? But what if that choice was already scripted by the unseen processes in your brain before you ever became aware of it? And what if even your reaction right now, your doubt, your curiosity, your skepticism, your openness, all of it was already initiated before you had the conscious thought, meaning that your feeling of choosing to continue is just consciousness catching up with what was already determined. And so let us dive into the story of this experiment and all that it unlocks, beginning with the subtle dance between neurons, time, and awareness. Because the first shock is that the readiness potential, the electrical buildup in the brain measured through EEG, rises hundreds of milliseconds before you report the conscious intention to move your finger or press a button, meaning the brain knew before you knew. And the second shock is that this has been replicated, refined, and extended, showing delays not just of milliseconds, but sometimes several seconds, with fMRI studies demonstrating brain patterns predicting decisions long before awareness, as though the unconscious mind is a vast ocean in which the small boat of conscious thought floats, believing itself to be the captain, when in truth the currents below already decided course. And as this realization deepens, we confront not only the collapse of the classical idea of free will, but also the necessity of rethinking the self itself. Because if I am not the true originator of choice, then what is I? What is consciousness? And what role does it play in the unfolding of life? And perhaps this is where the paradox becomes most potent. For while the experiment suggests your conscious mind is not the decider, it does not mean consciousness is powerless. Rather, it may be the stage upon which decisions are revealed, justified, and integrated, a theater of awareness where the deeper mind communicates its already chosen actions. And here arises a radical thought. Maybe free will was never about being the sole author of choices, but about being in relationship with the deeper layers of intelligence that operate within us. And yet before we soften the blow, let us linger in the discomfort of the implication. For society is built on the assumption of free will on law, ethics, religion, and even personal growth. And if that assumption crumbles, what remains? Can we still hold people accountable? Can we still aspire to change? Can we still believe in self-improvement? And the answer, though complex, may lie in a new model of agency where choice is redefined not as the conscious spark of decision, but as the ability to shape the conditions, the narratives, and the awareness in which unconscious processes unfold. And this leads us to the deeper question of why the brain would operate in such a way, why consciousness would come after, why the feeling of control will be preserved if it is not literally true. And here evolutionary psychology offers clues, suggesting that the sense of free will may be adaptive, a story consciousness tells to maintain coherence, accountability, and motivation. For if we knew every choice was already determined, we might collapse into nihilism. So the illusion of choice may itself be essential for survival, keeping us engaged, hopeful, striving, and resilient. And yet illusions can also be dangerous, for we cling to them too tightly. We miss the opportunity to see the deeper truths of existence, truths that may liberate us from fear, judgment, and guilt. For if choices arise from unconscious processes, then perhaps forgiveness becomes easier, compassion deeper, humility stronger, and a recognition that we are all carried by currents large in ourselves. And this recognition does not weaken us, but can in fact awaken us to a higher form of freedom, not the freedom of making isolated choices from nothing, but the freedom of aligning with the deeper flows of life, the freedom of awareness itself, the freedom of understanding that the story of I chose is just a chapter in a much vaster book. And as we move further into this exploration, we must also address the critics who argue that Libet's experiments are overinterpreted, that the readiness potential does not predict specific actions, that the conscious veto, the ability to stop an action after the unconscious prepares it, still preserves a form of free will. And here we enter the subtle territory of compatibilism, the philosophical position that free will and determinism can coexist, where even if unconscious processes initiate action, the conscious mind still has the capacity to shape outcomes, to intervene, to redirect, and this veto power has been called free won't, suggesting that while we may not always control what arises, we can control whether it is allowed to manifest. And yet even this is under scrutiny, as deeper studies show the veto may also be predicted by unconscious processes. So the debate continues, twisting deeper and deeper, and as it does, the question expands beyond neuroscience into metaphysics. Because if unconscious brain processes determine action, what determines the unconscious? Is it merely the chain of causality from genetics, environment, and prior states? Or is there something deeper, something non-local, something woven into the fabric of reality itself? And here's some speculated connections with the strange findings of physics, with the role of the observer in collapsing probabilities, with the idea that consciousness is not merely an emergent property of matter, but a fundamental field that interacts with reality in ways we do not yet understand. And while such connections remain speculative, they open the imagination to a radical possibility, that what we call unconscious may itself be a channel to a deeper layer of intelligence, a layer that transcends individual selfhood. And if so, then free will is not lost but reframed, no longer the isolated control of a separate ego, but the participation in a larger unfolding. And perhaps the experiment that seemed to strip away freedom is in fact pointing to a more expansive view of freedom, one that dissolves the illusion of separation and invites us to experience ourselves as expressions of a vast interconnected flow. And as we hold this possibility, the question becomes not, do I have free will, but what am I really, and what is the nature of the will that flows through me? And with this question, we step into the second half of our journey. For if Chapter 1 has deconstructed the illusion, Chapter 2 must reconstruct a new vision, weaving together science, philosophy, and lived experience into a tapestry of meaning that allows us not only to understand, but to live differently, more consciously, more compassionately, more aligned with the deeper truth that the experiment reveals. And so, as we prepare for Chapter 2, let's pause to reflect. The experiment shows us that the self is not the master, but perhaps the witness, not the author, but perhaps the reader of life's unfolding. And in that recognition may lie a freedom deeper than free will itself, the freedom of awakening to what has always been here, beneath the story of choice, beneath the illusion of control, the infinite awareness that watches it all. And so we stand at the threshold of the most unsettling yet liberating insight of modern psychology and neuroscience. The realization that what we call free will may not exist in the way we thought it did, and yet rather than collapsing into despair or nihilism, this revelation can become the gateway into a deeper and more authentic form of freedom. One not rooted in the fragile illusion of conscious authorship, but in the profound recognition of how consciousness actually participates in reality, And to grasp this fully, we must journey further into the experiment's implications through the layers of philosophy, spirituality, and lived human experience. For if Chapter 1 dismantled the illusion, Chapter 2 must now rebuild the meaning of our existence in light of it. And we begin with the most immediate question. If decisions are prepared unconsciously, what is the role of awareness? Why does consciousness exist at all? And why does it give us the vivid sense of choice when the data suggests otherwise? And here we encounter the strange paradox that perhaps awareness is not a controller but a revealer, not a commander but a stage where decisions unfold. And if so, then the true power of consciousness may not lie in creating choices ex nihilo, but in bringing light to what arises, in transforming blind impulse into integrated action, in turning unconscious patterns into lived meaning. And this shift from control to illumination changes everything, because suddenly, the purpose of awareness is not to dictate every detail, but to allow the story of the self to emerge coherently. And in doing so, consciousness still plays an indispensable role, for without it there will be no narrative, no memory, no identity, only scattered impulses and reactions. And so rather than saying we've lost free will, we might say that will is reframed. It is not the isolated ego choosing freely, but the whole organism participating in a vast causal web. And awareness gives shape and texture to this participation, allowing us to grow, to learn, to adapt, to create meaning, and this reframing opens a door of compassion. For when we see that even our greatest achievements or darkest failures arise from conditions far beyond the conscious self, we stop clinging to pride and stop drowning in guilt, recognizing instead that life is an unfolding process of infinite causes and effects. And in that recognition, compassion for self and others naturally expands. For how can we judge harshly when we see that everyone is moved by forces they themselves did not choose, forces of upbringing, biology, culture, and unseen unconscious dynamics? And yet this does not lead to passivity, but to empowerment. Because if we cannot always control what arises, we can still shape the conditions in which things arise. We can cultivate environments, practices, and inner states that make certain outcomes more likely. And here is where responsibility takes on a new meaning, not as the burden of absolute authorship, but as the skill of tending the soil of the mind, knowing that whatever grows depends on what we plant, how we water, and the climate we nurture. And so the experiment does not abolish responsibility, but transforms it, shifting it from blame and punishment toward care and cultivation. And this transformation has profound implications for society, for law, for education, for relationships, and for healing, because instead of condemning people as inherently bad or evil, we might see them as expressions of conditions, and instead of demanding they change by willpower alone, we might focus on shifting the conditions that shape behavior, providing support, guidance, compassion, and awareness so that new possibilities can emerge, and this in turn reshapes how we see ourselves, for rather than berating ourselves for not being strong enough, disciplined enough, or free enough, we begin to see that growth is less about sheer force of will and more about designing the conditions of life so that growth unfolds naturally. And when we live this way, the illusion of free will no longer binds us, but becomes a doorway into liberation, for we stop clinging to control and instead flow with the unfolding of life, aligning ourselves with a deeper intelligence that moves through us. And here we touch the mystical dimension of this realization. For many spiritual traditions have long taught that the ego's sense of doership is an illusion. That true. Freedom comes not from clinging to choice, but from surrendering to the flow of existence. And what neuroscience now suggests through the experiment resonates with what sages and mystics have whispered for millennia, that the I who claims to choose is not the true source of action, that life lives through us, that we are waves on an infinite ocean. And the freedom lies not in controlling the wave, but in realizing we are the ocean itself. And when this recognition dawns, a deeper peace enters. The mind, because we no longer have to fight against what is, no longer have to carry the impossible burden of being the sole author of existence, but instead can rest in the awareness that everything arises from an infinite web of causes. And our role is not to dominate, but to participate, to witness, to align, to co-create. And in that participation, a new kind of will emerges, a will not of ego, but a wholeness, not of isolated self, but of the universal intelligence moving through every breath, every heartbeat, every choice. And this kind will feels freer than free will ever did, because it is no longer fragile, no longer threatened by doubt, no longer dependent on clinging to illusion and control, but rooted in the unshakable truth that we are not separate from the unfolding of reality itself. And with this realization, we can return to the experiment with new eyes, no longer seeing it as the death of freedom, but as the unveiling of a deeper freedom, one that comes not from control, but from awakening. And this awakening is not abstract, but deeply practical, for it changes how we live day to day, how we treat others, how we relate to our own inner struggles, and how we approach the challenges of the world. Because when we see that others are not fully authors of their actions, we find compassion instead of condemnation, patience instead of rage. And when we see that our own struggles are not entirely of our choosing, we find gentleness instead of self-hatred, forgiveness instead of shame. And yet we also see that conditions matter, that awareness matters, that by practicing meditation, reflection, gratitude, and conscious living, we can shift the patterns of our unconscious, making new possibilities available. And in this way, the practice of life becomes not about exerting absolute free will, but about harmonizing with the flows of unconscious and conscious processes, guiding them like a gardener tends a garden, knowing we cannot command the seed to grow, but we can provide sunlight, water, and care. And in doing so, transformation happens. And this metaphor of the gardener reveals a profound truth. You are not the master, but the steward, not the dictator, but the participant. And this stewardship is sacred because it acknowledges the limits of control while embracing the possibilities of participation. And it is here that true responsibility resides, not in claiming to be the absolute author of every choice, but in tending the field of conditions that shape life. And once this shift in understanding takes root, the world looks different, for the anger we carry toward ourselves and others softens. The pride we cling to for accomplishments dissolves into gratitude. The despair we feel when we fail is replaced by curiosity, and the desire to punish gives way to the desire to heal. And this is not weakness but strength, not passivity but awakening. For in aligning with truth, we gain a power greater than the illusion of control. The power of presence, of compassion, of clarity, of alignment with reality as it is. And as this unfolds, the boundaries between science and spirituality blur. For neuroscience shows us the mechanisms while spirituality shows us the meaning. And together they point to the same realization. The self is not the ultimate decider, but awareness of this fact can unlock the highest form of freedom. A freedom not of will but of wisdom, not of ego but of awakening. And when we live this way, life ceases to feel like a battleground of choices, and instead becomes a dance of unfolding, a symphony in which we are both the instrument and the music. And here at last, the experiment that once threatened to strip us of dignity reveals itself as a gift, a mirror showing us the truth we had long ignored, that the story of free will was too small for the vastness of who we really are. And in letting go of that story, we step into the boundless reality of awareness, connection, and flow. And so as we conclude this exploration, let us not cling to despair or denial, but open to the radical possibility that freedom is not what we thought it was. That choice is not the property of a small, isolated ego, but the unfolding of an infinite web of causes illuminated by the light of consciousness. And in this illumination lies our truest power, the power not to command reality, but to awaken to it, to participate fully, to love deeply, to forgive endlessly, and to live each moment not as the author, but as the aware presence through which life itself expresses. And in this recognition, we discover that the experiment did not destroy free will, it expanded it beyond recognition, transforming it into something far greater. The freedom of awakening to what is and to what we have always been, the infinite awareness in which all choices, all actions, and all lives unfold.